Well, I appreciate the opportunity to present to you all today. What I'm going to be presenting is the 2022-2023 season brief update, because there's a lot of work that went on. There were a lot of hands in these efforts, not just these past 2 years, but this has been a space in which we have a lot of state extension specialists and agents working very hard to come up with some solutions to some really tough challenges for the growers, not just in the Tri-County agricultural area, but throughout the state. So just a quick outline of what we're going to be going through is a little bit of background about what the challenge is to our growers. And I'm sure you all have heard a lot about TMDLs, learned a lot about PNOC from Dr. Abriza, a lot of awesome opportunities for grant funding and how to get involved in this space because there's plenty of work to do. We're also going to talk about some prior activities and accomplishments, highlight a lot of the great work that was done by agents and specialists leading up into this point. And then we're going to jump into some of the significant findings from the past 2 seasons as they relate to the LBR and the work that was funded there at not just the Hastings Agricultural Extension Center, but also with our growers within the Tri-County agricultural area. And eventually, we're going to talk about some progress towards our objectives. We have some very honed in objectives for this project. We're going to talk about where we are in terms of our progress there. And then we're also going to, we're going to discuss some closing remarks, next steps, and open it up for some questioning. So background. For the last 2 years, I've really had the pleasure with working with some brilliant scientists on this. Dr. Fernanda Bortolozzo, Dr. Lakesh Sharma, Chrissy Fletcher, Dr. Lincoln Zotarelli, and Dr. Kelly Morgan. It's been a really great group. Everybody has slightly different and unique perception of what challenges we're facing, and that's really kind of blossomed into a pretty aggressive strategy on how we approach the research here. But ultimately, what we were trying to do at a high level is determine what the optimal phosphorus fertilization rate for potatoes is in North Florida, leveraging 2 different soil extraction methods, both the Mehlich 1 and Mehlich 3 soil tests. And the big question that we're still investigating the data, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is how do these 2 soil extraction methodologies, how they compare to one another, and how well can they predict or not predict commercial yield goals as it relates to phosphorus fertilizer inputs. So in order for us to do this work, there's a lot of different attributes about the production systems that we have to take into consideration. Some of which we can control, like the forms of the fertilizer, the timing, the placement, the rates, and really quantifying what the response is by the crop in the forms of yield, plant biomass, total phosphorus uptake, and also overall use efficiency. And we're going to cover mainly just yield because of a lack of time today, but also because we are still getting data from a number of our analytical labs. And it's a little bit, candidly, our data is a little bit premature for us to jump into and really get into the weeds on plant biomass accumulation and use efficiencies. But at the end of this presentation, what I'm optimistic for is that we are all going to be comfortable with at least extending the current provisional rate of 120 pounds of P2O5 to the acre. So there's a nice little QR code in here. You can go ahead and scan that if you want to learn more about our current potato phosphorus rate recommendations. Dr. Abriza, thank you so much for bringing up the BMP page. That has been a resource that we've been really hustling to try to get out into the community and be more proactive about addressing a lot of the questions that our growers have. So working with potatoes, I've been blessed to be able to work with potatoes starting back in 2011. Anybody that works with potatoes knows that it is a challenging crop, and the production systems in the Tri-County area are very unique. We have a shallow water table with a hard clay pan in there, heavy precipitation events. We see storms come off the river, off the St. Johns River. We are in the St. Johns River BMAP zone, and there's a lot of environmental concerns about what's happening in the agricultural space out there. But anatomically, potatoes have a shallow root system. And when you couple this with a relatively, when I say relatively, I mean respective to, let's say, other potato producing states, maybe in the Pacific Northwest and the northeastern part of the United States, we have a short growing season. And again, when you couple this with heavy precipitation, you can run into a lot of challenges, some of which you can and some of which you cannot address during our production season. So prior to 2022 provisional rate, and we'll get a little bit more into that, where we basically were at were, if you took a soil test in the Tri-County area or anywhere in the state for that matter, and your test came back less than 25 milligrams per kilogram, recommendation at that time is you could apply 120 pounds of P2O5 to the acre. If it was 26 to 45, it was 100. If it was more than 45 milligrams to kilogram, it was 0. In the TCAA, most of our soils test well above the high threshold. And so the challenge there is our own recommendations were really restricting the grower's capacity, in theory, to put out phosphorus fertilizer. But what we'll show you today is even with soils with a considerably high residual phosphorus level in the soil, we are still seeing a significant yield response, both total and marketable, in a number of different situations. So, recent potato research in nutrient space. I really got to give a shout out to David Liu. He did a large 3-year project at the Hastings Ag Extension Center, working closely with our growers in the TCAA. He looked at 3 different PTO5 rates at that time, 25, 50, and 100 pounds to the acre. They had 2 farms each year. It was a very, very beefy study, and they were able to peer review and publish that work. And it's really served as a springboard in most recent years for us to continue to dive into what is really going on. What is going on environmentally, what's going on crop physiology, what's going on in terms of environmental stewardship and pressures there with water quality. And so there in 2022, there was a very large lift, as you all know, with considerable funding through a legislative budget request, where they did a study at Gulf Coast REC, Southwest Florida REC had 2 studies, and then we had 6 study locations, both last year in 2022 and this year in 2023. We looked at, in the TCA, at 0, 45, 90, 135, 180, and 229 pounds to the acre P2O5. So it's a pretty wide swath from 0 all the way up to 229 pounds of phosphate to the acre. We were very confident at that time that we were going to see yield response, but a yield response that was also going to be limiting at that time. So again, try to approach this with statistical rigor, randomized complete block designs with replicates. But really what I want to call out here, and I know I've already touched on this, is there have been a lot of contributors in the space, including Dr. Lakesh Sharma's group, Wendy Musseline. We've had a number of agents over the years and state specialists really lend a helping hand in this. And one really strong consistency that we've seen is all of our researchers and agents are very cognizant of following our growers' advice as to what fertilizer sources should we be using, how should we be placing it, what's the appropriate timing for this, so that we're really trying to address their challenges directly through following what their practices are at a field level. And so just to kind of layer this on and give a shout out to Dr. Lincoln Zottarelli, there are 2 manuscripts that are also under development right now for prior work that was done, not just on potatoes, but also with cabbage at the Hastings Ag Extension Center and then the TCAA. And so what we're really starting to see is once you start to bring all of these efforts together, all this research together, whether it's in peer review, EDIS manuscripts, we're starting to see a narrative really start to develop, and it's a narrative that fits well around the quantitative data that we're looking at. And really one of those narratives is we are seeing an increased yield response in not just potato, but also in cabbage as you increase your pre-plant phosphorus applications. Again, this is in the presence of already residual high soil P levels. So he's seeing that in cabbage, and that also involves some liquid fertilizer, phosphorus fertilizer applications. So again, just doing great work. It's a team effort. It's taking a lot of hands, and there's a lot of publications that we're going to see go into peer review journals and EDIS manuscripts here in the next couple of years. So we're really trying to fast track a lot of that. So I'm hopeful that this was already discussed today, but if it hasn't, there was a provisional phosphorus rate. And again, my hat goes off to Dr. Tom Abriza. He had a very heavy hand in facilitating these conversations with PNOC, the Plant Nutritional Oversight Committee, and taking into consideration historical research and current efforts to help guide and make that decision and make sure that it was founded in science. But he was also very cognizant of how this was going to impact our stakeholders' livelihood throughout the state. So there was a formal announcement made in October of last year, and there was a provisional phosphorus fertilizer management recommendation at that time. And just some quick details, that the application rate may be determined independent of pre-plant soil tests. And again, this is being derived from a place of where Malik 1 and Malik 3 may not be the best indicators for commercial yield targets to help determine phosphorus inputs. P fertilizer may also be applied up to the current IFAS recommended rate of 120 pounds to the acre. So we've gone where if you tested high, the recommendation was 0. Now we're moving the needle to, even if you're testing high, because candidly we have some doubts and challenges with the Malik 1 and Malik 3, you can apply up to 120 pounds to the acre P2O5. Now there are a number of footnotes within our vegetable crop production handbook, and there's, again, because there's a lot of research that's going on in this space. But also there's an additional 25 pounds to the acre comment that's being made about cold soil conditions. So if you're maybe in a northern latitude part of Florida, or maybe even a northern state, having some additional phosphorus there at a pre-plant because it's cold soil conditions could help result in a increased yield response by the crop. Okay, so moving on to Northeast Florida results. So we don't have all of our soil sample data back from the 2023 season. We're talking several thousands of soil samples, several thousand tissue samples, so it's quite a lot of work. But I just wanted to present this table, and it's very text heavy, so I'm gonna kind of pass over this very quickly. But really the things to call out here is if you look at these columns labeled beginning Malik 1 P index and beginning Malik 3 P index, you're gonna see that they're all relatively high or very high. And this is what we expected getting into the Northeast Florida locations, were that we were going to continue to see really high Malik 1 and Malik 3 residual phosphorus levels. Now we went to hay fields that had never been in potato production. We went to onion fields that had been out of production for a long time. And candidly, we were not successful in finding a site location with our growers that would have been considered low to moderate phosphorus. It was very challenging. The closest we got was this medium Malik 1 threshold at the Hastings Center. And that ground is less than, I want to say it's been in production for about 10 years, and maybe 11 now. And so that's the closest we got. So again, our soil test data is, we haven't received all of our data from analytical labs for the current season, but as we're getting that, we are taking a look at it. So number of figures here, each one of these blocks represents a single location. So our Northeast Florida site 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. Well, where's number 5? Well, we had a challenge. Our grower put out some fertilizer on top of our trial location at Northeast Florida location number 5. And so we had to abandon that last year. Anybody that works in the on-farm space knows that these things do happen. They don't happen maliciously. They just happen by accident. You know, they're out there trying to pay their mortgage and farm. And sometimes fertilizer gets broadcasted on the wrong field. So that happened in 2022. But we still work with that grower. They're a huge supporter of the IFAS research and extension mission. But these 4 locations are highlighted in green. Ultimately, they're highlighted in green because they represent significant yield responses in relation to P2O5 application. So our x-axis here is going to be our P2O5 application rates, and our y-axis here are going to be tuber yield. The red lines increasing in most situations is going to be your marketable, and the blue is going to be your total yield. So obviously your marketable excludes any type of coals or rots or pick out and grading that you're going to have on the grading line, but also it's going to exclude undersized tubers that are not considered marketable in the chip industry. And I'm now just realizing I didn't call out what variety we were growing. We were growing Atlantic, an old public variety of chipping potato that's still fairly widely grown throughout the United States. So site 4 in 2022, we did not see a significant relationship, significant yield response. There was a number of complications that we had out there. It was planted very early. They had a cold snap. They had very wet soil conditions, poor germination. So you start having some of these environmental challenges, and ultimately what you end up is a lot of noise in the data, and you start to lose that relationship. So looking into 2023, and I'm only representing 3 of our locations for the sake of time, we're still exploring and really drilling down and drilling through our data. But our preliminary results are telling us that we are seeing a similar yield response pattern in 2023 as to what we saw in 2022. But I do want to kind of caution the audience here. We are still working through this data. We are still really trying to identify outliers and understand the crop physiological responses here. So, but we do, with confidence, feel that there's really a lack of evidence to limit P2O5 applications based on initial soil P test levels again. So PO2 and PO3 and PO4 are still relatively high on the MELIC1 and MELIC3 soil P levels, yet we're still seeing an increased yield response as you increase P2O5 application rates. So this is, although this is still provisional, you know, we're going to continue to really mine this as it comes in. But again, we feel like there's some supporting evidence here to extend our current provisional rate. I do want to call out, we did have a hail event. So anybody that works at the TCA and works at the Hastings Ag Extension Center, you're going to know that on April 27th this past year, we were hit by a biblical hail event, something that our growers in that area have never seen in their lifetime. Baseball size hail, winds up to, I think, 100 miles an hour, incredible damage to vehicles in some of our facilities, unfortunately. But we were able to go in within 72 hours and harvest our phosphorus trials at the Hastings Ag Extension Center. I really got to give a shout out to the Hastings crew. The potato program has been growing incredibly over the years. When we stepped in 2020, we were doing, you know, a few thousand plots a year, I think somewhere in 2,500. We were up to 8,000 last year, and we got everything done in under 4 weeks, which is pretty remarkable. We cannot support our stakeholders and our shareholders in that way without the support of the team out there. So where are we at progress, right? So fancy graphs, fancy numbers, where are we at on progress? Well, nearly all the proposed work for the current season is completed. We're just waiting on sample data to come back. Once we get all of our data, we are going to be working with the statistician, work on the modeling to really study the phosphate rate effects on potato yields across seasons. You know, do we combine years? Do we combine seasons? But also, again, we feel like the evidence supports a provisional rate extension of 120 pounds. So a P2O5 to the acre. So closing remarks and next steps. Multi-year trials showed real responses to P2O5 at a majority of our sites. Currently, we don't feel like soil tests alone indicate the need to limit P2O5 application for our growers, particularly as it relates to commercial yield goals that our growers have. Project and data analysis will soon be nearing completion. And at that time, you know, all of the agents and state specialists will be working on a very comprehensive EDIS document to put forth in hopes of turning our provisional rate into a more substantial long-term rate. So next steps, really, we're going to be investigating this next year. Timing of application to continue to really try to understand what phosphorus use efficiency looks like in the potato cropping system. And we're always looking at split applications, different forms, different rates. So a lot of work is going to continue to happen in that space. I wanted to pull this up because this is another great resource coming from Dr. Liu's group. Talks a lot about legacy phosphorus and different amendments and cover cropping strategies that can be used to help increase bioavailability of phosphorus in row crop production systems. So a lot of this is being continued to be reevaluated in the TCAA. Science is always changing. We need to change with it. And so he's really demonstrating a great job of doing this. And I do have a video in here, and I'll make sure to provide this deck to Dr. Lokesh Sharma. There's a video here of the hail in Hastings. It's pretty remarkable, but I have a feeling that I'm probably out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and pause right there.